How can the most powerful empire in history fall without anyone pushing it? Imagine a world where a single city represents the epicenter of order, strength, and civilization. A city whose armies seemed invincible and whose leaders were revered as immortal figures. This was Rome, much more than a capital. It was the beating heart of a world that stretched from the cold lands of Britain to the scorching deserts of Egypt. But what seemed eternal was about to crumble. It wasn't a sudden invasion or a superior enemy. It was a slow, relentless, and painful decline. The real enemy didn't come from outside. It already lived within its walls. Today we will explore the story of how Rome, the city where gods walked among men, was silenced by those it had underestimated: the Visigoths, the Vandals, and the most feared of all, Attila, the scourge of God. Prepare for a journey marked by ambition, collapse, and the end of an era that forever changed the destiny of humanity. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel Historia Viva so you don't miss our next adventures. And tell us in the comments, what other empire would you like to see fall in our next video? All right, historians, it's time to march on Rome. For centuries, Rome was not just a capital. It was the nerve center of the known world, the symbol of absolute power. Its marble columns reflected the glory of an empire many believed was eternal. In its forums echoed speeches that changed the fate of nations, and its legions crossed continents as if the entire world belonged to them by divine right. Rome was invincible. Rome was immortal. But this is not a story of glory. It's a story of downfall. Imagine walking its cobblestone streets, surrounded by temples dedicated to Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. Imagine feeling the power of a civilization that dominated from icy northern islands to burning southern deserts. In the Colosseum, the roar of the crowd rose as gladiators spilled blood for honor, while the Senate debated with the arrogance of those who thought they'd never be defeated. That same marble that adorned the temples would soon crack. Statues of emperors, once treated as deities, would lie destroyed in the dust. The city that taught the world the meaning of imperium would kneel before the very peoples it once called barbarians. Rome did not fall overnight. Its collapse was an echo that resonated through generations, an open wound that never healed. At the center of it all, the eternal city, witness to its peak and victim of its own arrogance. This chapter marks the beginning of an imperial tragedy. There will be no clear heroes or simple villains, just a civilization that flew so high it forgot how to keep its feet on the ground. While the barbarians still lived in their distant villages, the true threat already walked within Rome's walls. What could destroy a city built by the gods? You'll soon find out. For centuries, the borders of the Roman Empire still held, though barely, but the true collapse was already brewing at its core. What was once an exemplary system of organization, discipline, and loyalty became a machine corroded by greed, indifference, and political chaos. No one seemed able to stop the tide. The economy, which for centuries had supported entire legions and grand architectural projects, began to crumble. The fields, exhausted by centuries of intensive farming, no longer yielded enough. Gold coins were replaced by pieces of lesser value, unleashing rampant inflation. Taxes skyrocketed mercilessly, and small farmers, unable to pay, abandoned their lands seeking protection under the shadow of large landowners. Thus, unknowingly, the seed of feudalism was sown. But the deterioration went beyond economics. The Roman elites, who once put the state above their personal interests, were now immersed in constant power struggles. Every ambitious general saw the imperial throne as a personal goal, not a sacred duty. Between 235 and 284 AD, more than 20 emperors succeeded one another, many assassinated by their own soldiers. The empire was no longer governed. It was contested like spoils. The streets of Rome, once symbols of order and civility, now harbored revolts, internal looting, and a disenchanted population. Corruption seeped from the palaces into the legions. Soldiers no longer fought for honor, but for survival. Though the enemy was still far away, it could already smell weakness in the air. Rome still looked imposing, but its soul was broken. Because empires don't always fall to invaders. Sometimes they collapse because they no longer believe in themselves, because they forget what made them great. And while the walls still stood tall, the real collapse had already begun. What if they told you that the same men who once swore to protect Rome would be the ones to open the gates to its destruction? For centuries, the Roman legions were the epitome of order, power, and imperial pride. But over time, maintaining that colossal army became an unsustainable burden. Internal crises, lack of resources, and citizens' disinterest in serving forced Rome to make a desperate decision: hire its former enemies as defenders of the empire. Thus the Visigoths, Vandals, Suebi, and other Germanic peoples crossed the borders, not as invaders, but as allies. They were offered land, food, and a place within the empire in exchange for their swords. Some arrived with families, others with stories of hunger and persecution. What Rome saw as a practical solution would soon become a fatal mistake. The term barbarian was a Roman label for anyone who didn't live under their laws. But many of these peoples had complex cultures, power structures, and deeply rooted values. They weren't savages, they were survivors. Because those called barbarians didn't forget. They didn't forget when Rome destroyed their villages. They didn't forget the taxes, betrayals, and massacres. And though many tried to integrate, learning Latin, wearing togas, worshiping Roman gods, they were always seen as outsiders, as a silent threat. The Visigoths, in particular, experienced this contradiction in a brutal way. Treated with contempt by Roman bureaucrats, driven to starvation, and humiliated, they decided that if they couldn't belong to the empire, they would destroy it from within. Their leader, Alaric, was no savage. He was a strategist, and he knew that Rome, though still standing on 7 hills, was more vulnerable than ever. Borders no longer meant anything, because the enemy was no longer advancing from the north. The enemy was inside the Roman camps, commanding their troops, learning their strategies, waiting for the right moment. And when that moment came, they didn't need to scale walls. They just had to stop obeying. In the vast steppes of the East, where the wind whistles through the bones of ancient warriors, emerged a figure shrouded in legend and fear: Attila, the scourge of God. He was not Roman, nor Visigoth, nor Vandal. He was a Hun, and his name, spoken by emperors and peasants alike, carried an almost religious tremor. Unlike the Germanic peoples who sought land within the empire, the Huns didn't want to be part of Rome. They wanted to subdue it. Their goal wasn't integration, it was devastation. Where the Huns rode, nothing remained. Entire cities disappeared from the map. Fields burned. Rivers ran red with blood. And at the center of this storm was him, Attila, a leader who spoke little, but whom everyone obeyed without question. For the Romans, Attila was an anomaly. He didn't respond to diplomacy. He wasn't seduced by gold, at least not for long. He didn't aspire to crowns, temples, or titles. His sole purpose was to break the will of those who believed themselves invincible. In 451, the Western Roman legions, allied with the Visigoths, yes, those who were once enemies, faced Attila in the Battle of the Catalonic Fields. It was unprecedented carnage. Though Attila's advance was halted, it wasn't a clear victory. The scourge of God retreated, but wasn't defeated. A year later, Attila marched toward Italy. Cities fled before his arrival. Rome trembled. Pope Leo I went out to meet him. No one knows exactly what they said. What is known is that Attila turned back. He didn't sack Rome. He didn't destroy the heart of the empire. Perhaps it was superstition, perhaps illness, or perhaps because it was no longer necessary. Rome was already dying inside. Attila didn't conquer Rome, but he made her feel fear. And sometimes, fear is more powerful than any sword. For centuries, Rome had been the jewel of the world. Its walls seemed invulnerable, its emperors untouchable. For many, the mere idea that Rome could be sacked was blasphemy. But in 410, that blasphemy became reality. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, crossed the gates of the eternal city. He didn't break them. He didn't burn them. He opened them because the Romans themselves could no longer defend them. For 3 days, Rome descended into chaos. The houses of the nobles were looted, the temples desecrated, the streets bathed in terror. The people, accustomed to looking down on the so-called barbarians, now begged them for their lives. The empire that had conquered half the world fell to its former allies. But that wasn't the only blow. Almost half a century later, in 455, a new horror arrived: the Vandals. This time, the looting was more systematic, more brutal. They loaded ships with treasures, statues, sacred relics. The gold of centuries of conquest disappeared on the African horizon. Rome was no longer the capital of the world. It was a plundered shadow, wounded, humiliated. And yet, the city didn't disappear. Its stones remained. Its history too. But its soul had given up. In 476, Odoacer, a leader of Germanic origin, deposed the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, Romulus Augustulus. There was no great battle, no heroic resistance, just an awkward silence, as if Rome finally accepted that its time was up. The empire that had resisted for over 1,000 years disappeared without glory. Rome didn't fall with a roar. It fell with a sigh, and the world was never the same again. The imperial eagles no longer flew over the walls. The banners of Rome, symbols of absolute power, lay on the ground. But the end of the Western Roman Empire wasn't the end of everything. It was the beginning of something new, uncertain, chaotic. Instead of a single authority, Europe fragmented. In the power vacuum, Germanic kingdoms emerged where Roman provinces once stood. The Visigoths founded their own kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. The Vandals ruled from North Africa. The Ostrogoths settled in Italy. The imperial order was replaced by unstable alliances, endless wars, and a new social structure, feudalism. But Rome didn't disappear. Its customs, laws, language, everything survived somehow. In monasteries, monks copied ancient texts so knowledge wouldn't be lost. In cities, ruins served as quarries and shelters. Stones that were once temples became Christian churches. Christianity, once persecuted by emperors, became the backbone of the new order. The Church inherited the spiritual power of Rome, and over time, also the political power. The Pope occupied a place not even the consuls had imagined. Meanwhile, the Eastern Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine Empire, resisted for nearly 1,000 more years, preserving part of the Roman legacy. But the West, the cradle of Rome, sank into what historians would later call the Middle Ages. The fall of Rome wasn't just the collapse of a city or government. It was a seismic shift in human history. It marked the end of antiquity and the beginning of a new era. Because sometimes for something new to be born, the old must burn to the ground. Thanks for watching this far. If you liked this video and are passionate about this type of content, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos and discover more fascinating stories. See you in the next video.